You know, for the first time in generations, the U.S. Navy's total command of the seas is facing a real, serious challenge. And it's all happening in the Indo-Pacific, where this incredibly tense naval showdown is playing out between the U.S. and a China that's modernizing its military at a breakneck pace. So let's get right into it and unpack this massive shift in global power.
Now listen to this. The ship is slowly sinking. That is a pretty chilling warning, right? And it comes directly from a high-ranking U.S. Navy official. This isn't some kind of dramatic overstatement for the cameras. It's a brutally honest take on a trend that has planners in Washington, losing sleep. And what's at the heart of it all? Simple. China is just building its Navy way, way faster than the U.S. is right now. And this is the chessboard, the Indo-Pacific. Look, this isn't just a huge patch of blue on a map. We're talking about the new center of gravity for the entire planet, economically, strategically, you name it. Everything that happens here, from the tiniest reef in the South China Sea to the waters around Taiwan, is going to shape the rest of our century. It's that important.
All right, so that brings us to our first major topic, the new naval arms race. And yeah, arms race is exactly the right term. What we're seeing right now is a shipbuilding frenzy, a weapons boom that honestly feels like a throwback to the Cold War.
I mean, just think about it for a second. Ever since the Soviet Union collapsed, the U.S. Navy has been, well, the only game in town. Nobody even came close. American aircraft carriers could sail pretty much wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. They were the undisputed kings of the ocean. Well, that long, quiet era of total dominance, it's over, officially.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. Let's size up the fleets. How do the navies of the U.S., China, and their key allies in the region actually compare? Because when you start looking at the numbers, things get really interesting.
The first thing you've got to understand is the money behind all this. Just look at that bar for China. Back in 1996, their military budget was about $14 billion. By 2020, it had exploded to over $252 billion. That's not just a little jump, that's an 18-fold increase. And all of that cash is what's paying for this giant new Navy.
So what does all that spending get you? It gets you this number, 355. That's how many ships and submarines China's Navy, the plan, has in the water right now. And just by that simple count, that makes them the largest Navy on the entire planet.
And this table here really lays out the situation in the region, and it's pretty stark. Just look at the raw numbers. China's active military personnel absolutely dwarfs Taiwan's and Japan's put together. More submarines, more warships, way more fighter jets. Now sure, numbers aren't the whole story, but let me tell you, when you're a military planner, a chart like this is a huge, huge deal. Now all this hardware, all this military buildup, it really all points to one place. Our third section, the Taiwan flashpoint. This might just be the single most dangerous spot on Earth right now.
You see, it all comes down to geography. Taiwan is the absolute linchpin of what strategists call the first island chain. Think of it like a giant wall that sort of bottles up China's military. If China ever took control of Taiwan, it's like pulling the cork out of the bottle. Their Navy and Air Force would suddenly have a wide open door to the Pacific, and that would be a direct threat to U.S. allies like Japan and the Philippines.
And that geographic fact is exactly why Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said this: "A Taiwan emergency is a Japanese emergency." He couldn't have been clearer. For Japan, this isn't some abstract problem happening somewhere else. A conflict over Taiwan is happening right on their doorstep, threatening their security and the shipping lanes that are their economic lifeblood.
So, if you're China, you know the U.S. and its allies are probably going to show up to the party. So what's your game plan? Well, it's all about creating what we'll call China's keep-out zone.
Now, the official military term for this is a mouthful: anti-access/area denial, or A2AD for short. But the idea is actually super simple. It's basically about putting up a giant, invisible, no trespassing sign for the U.S. military. The whole point is to make it so dangerous, so costly, that the U.S. Navy can't even get close enough to join the fight.
So, how do they build this keep-out zone? With a whole bunch of really advanced, really scary stuff. We're talking about weapons like the YJ-21 hypersonic missile. They literally call it a carrier killer for a reason. It's incredibly fast. Then you add over 1,000 short-range ballistic missiles pointed at Taiwan and nearby bases. And don't forget, this also includes high-tech stuff like the ability to jam satellites or launch cyber attacks. It's a full-spectrum threat. But
The U.S. Navy is not just sitting back and accepting this as reality. As when Top Admiral put it, this whole A2/AD bubble isn't some impenetrable keep-out zone. He basically said it's what China wants it to be, an aspiration, not what it actually is. It's not a checkmate. In their eyes, it's just a new, very difficult problem that they have to solve.
Which, of course, brings us to the American countermove. So how are the U.S. and its allies changing their own game plan? Let's look at the U.S. alliance playbook.
The new American strategy can really be summed up in two phrases: be harder to find and harder to kill. So instead of clumping all their ships together in one big, juicy target, they're spreading everything out, dispersing smaller groups of ships over huge areas. They're also leaning heavily into unmanned ships and drones, and they're buying longer-range weapons so they can shoot back from a safer distance. It's all about making the fleet more resilient and much more lethal.
And if you want to know the one thing that makes this entire American strategy possible, it's this map. It's Japan, plain and simple. Those U.S. bases, the airfields, the ports, the home of the 7th Fleet, they are absolutely essential. Without them, there is just no way for the U.S. to effectively respond to a crisis over Taiwan. It would be almost impossible.
So what happens if the worst actually happens? If deterrence fails and these two giants actually come to blows? What would that war even look like? It raises the question, is this a war nobody can really win?
Well, all the time, these big strategic think tanks try to answer that very question. They run incredibly detailed war games, basically complex computer simulations. They plug in all the numbers, all the weapons, all the geography, and they hit go. And the results that keep coming back are, well, they're really, really sobering.
And here's the bottom line from one of the most respected analyses. It basically says that the U.S. would likely win. They would stop an invasion of Taiwan. But, and this is a huge but, the cost would be absolutely staggering. We're talking about devastating losses of ships, of aircraft, and of lives. On all sides, it would be the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, where you win, but you lose so much in the process that you have to ask yourself if it was even worth it.
And that really brings us to the final, critical question, doesn't it? In a war where even the winner loses so much, where victory is just that costly for everyone, maybe the only battle that can actually be won is the one that's fought before any shots are ever fired. Maybe deterrence, just preventing the war from ever happening, is the only real victory there is.